Hello, everyone. Welcome to my studio. I am Helen Klebesadel. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm an artist, an educator, and an activist. I am inviting you into my studio today to talk a little bit about my art and my creative process and how I think about myself as a feminist artist, both a feminist and an artist, but a feminist artist. You caught me with a wall full of paintings. I've been doing a online virtual watercolor class for the last 5 weeks and have another 5 weeks to go. I've done the pandemic pivot and am taking my teaching online. It turns out that in this day and age, just doing any kind of creative work can really be a solace and a way to deal with the kinds of things we had to deal with during the pandemic. I started out as a professor of art at Lawrence University. I taught there for 10 years, teaching visual art and gender study classes. And then in 2000, I moved to UW System here in Madison, Wisconsin, and started a position as a director of what was then the Women's Studies Consortium. It's now come to be the Women and Gender Studies Consortium. And I did that for 18 years, first at UW System Administration and then later at UW Madison. And it was an extreme pleasure for me to do that work for all those years. But during all that time, I was also doing my own personal art. And then in 2018, I retired from the university to full-time art making and private teaching. And you can see that I've been doing that ever since. I've had a studio here in Madison since 2004. I built it especially for the purpose of creating my art. I mentioned earlier that I consider myself both a visual artist and an activist. And that's because I think about my creative work as my women's studies or gender studies research. I believe that there's not a topic in women and gender studies that you can find that does not have an artist doing something around that topic. My most involved artwork has been around both the place of women in society and as artists particularly, but also in recent years I found myself more and more engaged in the process of using art to talk about climate change and how we might find a way to engage people in dealing with this crisis that's in front of us. How do we overcome our fear of climate change and the overwhelming nature of the kinds of things we really have to grapple with? And one of the ways I've been trying to do it for the last decade is to use art to engage people in a conversation about climate change and the kinds of things that each of us need to do in order to move forward toward the world we'd actually like to live in by using whatever skills we have. And for artists, it makes sense that you use what you have, and what you have is the art. So make art about the parts that matter most to you. If you're in another field, I encourage you to use those skills to choose. You can't do everything, so choose the thing you can do and do that. If all of us did something, it would be a lot better than we are right now. So anyway, let me just take you through some images of the art that I have done over the years, and I'll make this relatively short and painless, but it'll give you some insights into where I'm coming from as an artist, both historically and now. But I hope you're able to join me for the roundtables that I am participating in here at the conference too. So let's get started. Making a life as a feminist watercolor artist. I have used my art to think and to explore. I use my art making to better understand who I am, what I believe, and who, what, and how I value and how I came to value. So from the very beginning, my questions have been, who gets to be an artist? I'm a Wisconsin farm girl. That question wasn't clear to me. How do I become an artist? What's good art? What can art be about? What are the right materials for art making? And who does get to decide that anyway? As a Wisconsin farm girl, I went off to art school when I was 17 to a wonderful school in Milwaukee where I was taught not by a single woman artist nor about a single woman artist. And I eventually became an educator who decided she was going to do something about that. But I became an artist, and I was able to find the time, the money, and the space to create my own art. Well, actually, never all three at the same time, but I didn't let that stop me. So I have this beautiful building in Madison. Unfortunately, it's in Madison, so it's here in the winter too. And I cozy into that studio and I create my art. I often used visual metaphors to talk about the kinds of things that matter to me. I consider this one to be a self-portrait. It's called Organized Chaos. And I have a few tips. I think art making is thinking. It's a product of the reflections of my life that have created my work. I think the process matters more than the product. And I think it matters more that you make art rather than what you make. I think that your art just documents the process of your thinking along the way. So keep making. I started out by using kind of surrealist imagery to do an exploration of who I was as a person and to kind of rethink all those things that I was taught to believe in as a young woman, as a child, and rethink those things and decide which I believed. I found myself doing surrealist imagery that explored all the myths and stories that I was taught as a young woman and a child as to what I could be, what women could be, and what women's anger was. And I discovered that I could revision some of those stories and make them more true for myself. Early on, Medusa was a metaphor for me about women whose anger paralyzed them. But then eventually I realized that in facing the anger, I could be free and that I could remember. This is called Medusa Remembered, and take back those parts of myself that had been cut off and face it with other people. And I could take those pains and wrap them and transform them and make them something else again. These are quite large paintings. They're all watercolors, and they're all really personal reflections on who I wanted to be in the world. So that whole series was something that helped form my future and taught me how to think through my art about those things I didn't have words for. One of the things I mentioned earlier is, well, who gets to be an artist and what can be considered art and what is art made out of? And as a rural woman, I realized that the only artists that I knew were were women who did not consider themselves to be artists and men who did not consider themselves to be artists. They used woodworking and fibers and things that had an everyday use in order to create, use their creative energy in order to bring it into the world. So when I paint a painting about women's traditional arts and maybe build it around a tablecloth, my tablecloth takes up the whole painting. I did a whole series of paintings of the quilts that were made by the women that I grew up with, and that in which each stitch was a blessing and a kiss to the people that they cared about, as they created art that was made to warm the people they cared most about. My tip, another tip. If you seek to make better art, make more art, just keep making it. You can't help but get better the more you make it. Just don't stop making. And if you do, remember it's never too late to start again. It's never too late. Certainly, you do one little piece at a time and you piece it together not unlike a quilt. The quilting itself became a metaphor for me as a very busy educator who had to do little bits and pieces of painting here and there around the edges in order to earn tenure and go on with my career as an artist. Those quilt metaphors are also a metaphor for the hospice organization. This is me painting my hospice comforters that I was commissioned to paint for the local hospice center here in Madison. Um, the idea that the quilt can bring comfort to people at all stages in their lives. So in all cultures, artists are activists because this is what I believe. Because especially in this culture, because it's an act of resistance to create anything at all in a culture that doesn't value it. Really, if you can learn to think for yourself, you have to learn to think for yourself to be an artist and have agency. So I feel like when I'm teaching art to people, I'm actually teaching them how to think for themselves, how to become the thinkers they want to be, and I think that's very handy when you take it to the voting booth. This painting, Diana's quilt, is also about how I value quilting and painting. We did a direct exchange. I created a painting of a quilt that Diana made me, and we just traded straight up. And the idea was that both of our creative work was worth the same amount. It took her 2 years to do the quilt, dealing with all the life things in her life. And it took me about the same time. So by the time we did this wonderful exchange up in Door County, it had been 4 years from our original idea. I do a lot of paintings about the beauty of nature and celebrating the world I live in and the world I value. I mentioned that I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and I grew up in a very beautiful part of the driftless area of Wisconsin. And that celebration, that observation of nature has always been a part of my work. I do nature journals and plein air painting almost, well, very often. And so kind of document the places I've been and the places I appreciate and the places I want to save. I'm inspired on my daily dog walks by the clouds that are in the sky and by the storms coming in and by the pure act of nature. The sunsets as the trees become silhouettes against the sky. Artists are some of the few people that are allowed to just stop and observe and absorb, and I think that's part of our job, to stop and notice and document and share so that other people notice what they're missing. That's probably one of the most important jobs we have. But so I've created whole series. The paintings I'm showing you are just little one or two pieces out of a whole series of things that celebrate. One of my series was wild orchids, and especially endangered wild orchids. And then I like to use imagery as metaphor. So when I think about what's an appropriate subject for art, I say whatever you want to be the subject of your art is an important subject for art. I find the fractals repeated in nature, in streams and in branches, to be a very important metaphor for the idea that everything we do is connected. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. What we do to ourselves, we do to the earth. And that becomes an underlying theme in much of what I do. Oftentimes, nature and humans interact. I don't think we always remember that nature is not separate from us. We are nature. And that's why some of my imagery is both reflecting the fractals and the branching that takes place in the branches, but it's also the nervous system and our circulatory system, and how our circulatory system is not that different from the planet's. This next piece I'm showing you here is a piece, one of my mandalas, and it's called Everything's Connected, because everything is connected. This happens to be a watercolor on canvas. Most of what I've shown you is watercolor on paper. So I use nature as a metaphor, but sometimes I just paint it directly, recording those things that are most endangered or threatened. I have a particular fondness for the disappearing Wisconsin prairies. So I spent a fair amount of time learning about the prairie plants that are disappearing and some of the ones that are threatened, and also trying to help other people recognize them so we can protect them. I'm also interested in how they interact, like this piece. Carners and lupin depend on each other for survival. So for prairie enthusiasts, there's a lot of information in some of these paintings in terms of the kind of plants that are interacting and the kind of prairie creatures that may be there too. It's given me great joy to learn these things. There's a fringed prairie orchid there. And to be able to create compositions that celebrate the prairie, because if we can learn to love it, we might work to save it. That's really a lot of what this kind of work is about, is both to reinforce the people that are working to save and to invite more people to love nature enough to start to understand it, recognize it, and do what they can to save it. So these are my prairie grasses, and I also do prairie fires, which is a great metaphor for fire sweeping in and cleaning up all the weeds and opening up all the seeds and starting again. So I've been doing environmental climate art projects for over a decade. It grows out of many years of concerns about how long have you been hearing about climate change and environmental changes that are threatening and not seeing much done about it. So I just started to put it in my work. I just started to put my concerns and what I was learning in my work and try and lure people in with beauty. So I have a series of paintings called Where Are the Bees, which is talking about bee decline. I've also been very concerned about climate warming. This is called Winter's End. And in each of these ice blocks, you can see images of creatures that are endangered and threatened when we lose cold. And will move, they may not die, but they're going to move north. So as the ice melts, they disappear from our lives. And I spent a long time researching this too, to discover which species we were most endangered of losing and what had to happen in order to save them. I also try new materials and new approaches in my making. I love transparent watercolor, but you're never done learning. So I do a lot of painting of watercolor on canvas as well. Milkweed flowers, I'm sure many of you know, are the food of monarchs. I'm interested in some tropical plants. My spouse is Puerto Rican, and we like to understand what's happening there as well. This is a watercolor on board that's about the extinction of the passenger pigeon from a show called Moving Target. The piece was part of a traveling exhibition. And then I've done other paintings that are looking at the elements. This is called Earth Element Drought, and another one called Water Element Precipitation. This is a close-up of the larger piece that it's a part of, and these are all watercolors on canvas as well. So my exploration of the materials sometimes overlaps my exploration of the issues. And then as a good feminist, I also believe in collaboration. If we can't figure out how to work together, we're not going to be able to make any kinds of changes happen. And in fact, I think collaboration, especially for someone who loves spending time alone in their studio, collaboration can be the hardest thing to do. But I have had the fortune of being a participant in several collaborative projects, and two of which I'm co-sponsors with, one with Allison Gates and another with Mary Kay Newman, and they have been wonderful collaborative partners. The Exquisite Uterus Project, The Art of Resistance, is a project Allison and I have done where we invited women artists especially, to tell us what they thought should be done with their uteruses, since the legislatures around the country seem to think that they had something to say about it. So Allison and I put out a call, actually in response to a Women in Gender Studies conference that was taking place at UW Oshkosh. And we ended up with over 200 pieces. We've done the show multiple times now. Over 200 pieces from women and men from 3 countries that shared their work. They all had the same blank uterus image to work with, but they could do whatever they wanted, because after all, it's their uterus and they should get to decide. So I was blown away. We both were blown away by the wonderful works that emerged from our call. We just had these wonderful pieces of art that were being mailed to us, and we would open them and prepare them for display. We've created a website where you can see this work. It's called exquisiteuterus.com. So please do take some time and take a look at it. We are sending the uteri back. We consider ourselves to be the uterati. And we are sending them back right now. From going forward, the website will be the exhibition. But we encourage people. We make the blanks available to people. You can purchase them. If you want to know how to, just contact me, and I'll direct you to where you can find them. We encourage people to do it in their local communities. Many have used this as an opportunity to bring people together. Artists help them create their own expressive uteri, and they bring in people for voter registration. The other collaborative project that I've spent several years on working with Mary Kay Newman is called The Flowers Are Burning. And it's a project that uses the images of beauty from nature to talk about climate change. And we also have a website that has a lot of information about climate change issues and other artists and writers who are talking about climate change as well. Um, it is called the flowersareburning.com. And that'll give you a lot of information about our watercolor exhibition. We both do separate paintings that are about the topic, but unlike most artists, we also have a whole series of watercolor paintings we've done together, which is an entirely new level of collaboration and something that has turned out to be work very, very well for us. There's Mary Kay and I with some of our creations. The one we're holding between us is actually a collaboratively painted piece. We have been working on this project since 2012 and have had several different versions of it on display around especially around the state. Our most recent version, we decided to focus in on the changes that are happening in the ocean and focus on the warming oceans and their effect on ocean coral. The whole project is built around, again, the same thing. If we can learn to love it, will we work to save it? And can we use our art and beauty to try and lure people in past the denial and the pain and the fear to really think about what they too love and what they're willing to work to save. Our most recent version was supposed to have happened this spring spring of 2020, and we all know what happened that spring. We're scheduled to have an exhibition at the Holy Wisdom Monastery of our most recent body of almost all collaboratively painted paintings, but we had to cancel it. But we did a pivot, and we put the whole exhibition online, and you can go to our The Flowers Are Burning .com, Oceans Are Rising, and in the exhibition area you will find all of the work from that exhibition. This particular one is a watercolor that I did for the exhibition. We have one or two that we each did individually. This one is a bleached coral. But I would love it if you would go ahead and take a peek at that exhibition. It will be going on in perpetuity as a part of our website. So here's my final tip. There is power in persistence. Just keep making. Just start and keep making. And one day you're going to look up and you'll have been making art for 40 years and you'll have a career that you wouldn't trade for anything. So if you haven't started yet, there's still time. Start making, start doing whatever it is that you most care about, and use that to make your mark on the world. Use that to do the kind of change. It doesn't mean you can't tithe time toward other kinds of social change too, but let's assume that what you're best at is what the world needs. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. And thank you for joining me in my studio. I hope you've had a good time and I hope you find it useful. Thank you. Bye bye.